Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The White House is unveiling its most sweeping strategy yet to combat rising cases of COVID-19. It includes a new requirement that all companies with at least 100 employees mandate vaccinations or enforce routine testing. It also outlines vaccine requirements for certain healthcare providers and all federal employees and contractors. People who fail to comply will face disciplinary action, including possible termination. Limited exemptions will be allowed for certain disabilities or for religious objections. President Biden introduced the six-pronged approach Thursday.
We have the tools to combat the virus if we can come together as a country and use those tools. If we raise our vaccination rate, protect ourselves and others with masking, expanded testing, and identify people who are infected, we can and we will turn the tide on COVID-19. It'll take a lot of hard work. It's going to take some time. Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated, even though the vaccine is safe, effective, and free.
And in the wake of America's departure from Afghanistan after 2 decades, the Taliban's promises of a more moderate government are failing to materialize. Despite that, Russia, China, and Iran appear poised to formalize relations with the incoming regime. China is offering the group $30 million in aid. Earlier, State Department spokesman Ned Price expressed concern over the initial appointments to the interim Afghan government.
We are not going to make sweeping categorical judgments just yet. We have spoken about our reaction to the initial caretaker government. You have heard us say that the lack of inclusivity, the track records, the backgrounds of some of the individuals involved is a cause for concern. It certainly does not reflect what the international community and what, as a part of that, the United States hoped to see.
The first passenger plane since the U.S.'s withdrawal was allowed to depart from Kabul on Thursday. Americans, Canadians, and British citizens were on board. What remains uncertain is the fate of Afghan citizens who assisted the United States in various capacities over the past 20 years. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Blinken announced accused the Taliban of not permitting flights to depart in violation of their agreement. Today, the White House defended itself after releasing a statement on the first international flight, which described the Taliban as businesslike.
We are here to celebrate the return of American citizens who wanted to leave Afghanistan, of legal permanent residents, of Afghans who fought by our side, to Qatar successfully on a Qatari Airlines flight. And in order to get those people out, we had to work with some members of the Taliban to press them and to work in a business-like manner to get them out. That is what we were stating in the statement.
For more on what's happening in Afghanistan and to look at the legacy of the U.S. response to 9/11, I want to bring in Margret Brennan. She is CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation. Margret, welcome back. Congratulations, by the way. I think this is the first opportunity I've had to talk to you since you've been back from maternity leave, but a lot to talk about. You're coming back, of course, at a very busy time. So let's start with the news of what is happening on the ground in Afghanistan. What are the challenges that President Biden's national security team has to try and solve?
Thank you, Elaine, for that warm welcome back. It is so great to talk to you. And it is so disturbing, frankly, where we are with the situation in Afghanistan, because the Biden administration officials are working and very focused on the specifics of just getting, as you mentioned, the Americans who remain there out of the country, and doing this diplomatic dance where they're referring to the Taliban as businesslike and professional in conversations. And really saying, but we hope that you will sever ties with al-Qaeda, include women, and exclude terrorists from your government. It's a very sort of awkward diplomatic dance that they are doing right now. When it comes to Afghanistan, The challenge here is that the administration is trying to contain any kind of threat of a potential failed state. When they are talking about government not being inclusive, as you heard Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, say, he's not only referring to on paper what it doesn't include, but in the prospects of a civil war. They are concerned that Afghanistan will implode into infighting between ethnic groups. They are specifically calling out the Taliban government for excluding all women from their government, something that had been enshrined in the Constitution that the United States helped write for the government that dissolved suddenly over the past month. And they are also very diplomatically nodding to the fact that an FBI wanted terrorist is included as an interior minister within the Taliban government. They have so many challenges in trying to manage this on the diplomatic front, but really they are taking a very cold, hard look and calculus here and judging that at the moment, President Biden can achieve his campaign promise of withdrawing troops and contain any potential terror threat. This is a huge gamble, but that is what they are betting, that they can turn their eye, issue condemnation of human rights violations if Afghans kill Afghans, but that if the fighting remains contained, it will not become a U.S. national security problem.
But what realistically, Margaret, what options does the United States actually have to try and preempt and disrupt terrorist plans without a significant presence in Afghanistan?
Well, you put your finger right on it. And even today, the UN, I want to read the statement they said today regarding UN staff, United Nations staff in Afghanistan. They're concerned about their safety. And they said al-Qaeda members remain in Afghanistan visibly welcomed and sheltered by the Taliban authorities. That's al-Qaeda. There's also ISIS. So the threat and the concern here is that you need to be able to continue to operate at this scale and with the force that the intelligence community has conducted for the past 20 years, but not have the protection of military forces around there to secure a U.S. presence on the ground. How do you do that? The Biden administration is gambling and saying that the intelligence community has the capabilities remotely to keep up the kind of pressure on these terror groups that they've been putting in place for the past 20 years. That is going to be something we will see tested. The actual, when you look at what this means, when you hear that phrase over the horizon capabilities from the Pentagon, that's a euphemism for a drone or a plane dropping a bomb. It is a euphemism for being able to watch from afar. And those bases right now are about 8 to 9 hours away in Qatar. Behind the scenes, you have some negotiations happening to try to secure spaces that are closer to the Afghan border within surrounding countries. And that is something that you see U.S. officials doing quietly behind the scenes. You've seen these reports of the CIA director, for example, Bill Burns, speaking to leaders in India and in Pakistan. If you take a look at the map, Afghanistan is surrounded by 3 different nuclear powers. This is a region of the world where the U.S. needs to have eyes on. And the question is, how do they do that in a way that doesn't put Americans in a combat position or directly in harm's way? And that is something the Biden administration is still figuring out.
Well, Margaret, it's been remarkable to see the different posture towards the Taliban. For instance, I remember listening to a Pentagon briefing where we had General Frank McKenzie, who is the head of CENTCOM, talking about essentially the relationship, a working relationship, as that evacuation and the U.S. withdrawal was taking place, with the Taliban providing security checkpoints. Can you describe for us what is different about the Biden administration's posture and attitude toward the Taliban?
Well, this is transactional. That's a word you heard a lot during the Trump administration. In this case, it is a word that refers, I think, accurately to how the Biden administration is figuring things out on the ground. It's a transaction. It's we will keep you at arm's length, Taliban. Let's see what kind of government you form. We're going to keep your money frozen in accounts around the world. We will use that leverage to see if you behave in a way that we can at least stomach, if not condone. And we'll work with you in these ways because this is at least a beginning of a government that's being formed. So in the situation on the ground, military leaders were left with not many choices. The U.S. military presence had been whittled away and down to such a really modest footprint that military leaders had to make calculations on how to behave based on the resources they had at the time. They were not really able to plus up in a way they needed to forces until they were really in a place where it became a must-do just to evacuate. But to be able to go in and secure other areas or have the kind of presence on the ground to create, for example, as we were talking about at the time, a barrier around the airport, those were things the U.S. didn't physically have the capability to do in terms of troops on the ground and didn't have the willingness to do. And so they had to rely on the Taliban. But in the future, can Americans accept that idea? Probably difficult for many to stomach. The thing we're not talking about is, of course, the other actors in the region. And Pakistan is a huge factor here. The CIA director, as I mentioned, was in the region in South Asia talking to leaders there and looking at that. They have a huge amount of influence over the Taliban, their intelligence services. In fact, the very first foreign leader to go on the ground and visit with Taliban leadership was from Pakistan. That is going to be one way that the United States still has to deal with Afghanistan through their neighbors and the people who in many ways support and have helped to foster the Taliban and the Haqqani network, who are very much intertwined even within this new government.
Finally, Margaret, this weekend marks 20 years since the September 11th attacks. And I want to ask you broadly, how did 9/11 reshape American foreign policy over the past 2 decades?
That's such a huge question because it really reshaped everything, didn't it? I mean, I remember studying Arabic as a student at the time, and it was a small department at a university in the lower level of UVA's liberal arts, portion of the school. And suddenly, every dollar, every funding, every interest after 9/11 was funneled in after the fact to trying to figure out a region of the world that the United States was well known in, but the American people were perhaps not well briefed on. And it became everything in terms of the American thinking. It upended our surveillance domestically. It changed what the FBI is and how it conducts itself. It really, in many ways, became a reshaping of our intelligence community that was so focused on preventing this from happening again. It created suspicion among Americans. While it in some ways unified us and spiked patriotism, it also divided us. The amount of xenophobia and Islamophobia within the United States that erupted out of that. I mean, it really just eked through the fabric of who we are in so many different ways. And foreign policy-wise, it became kind of the driving thing for the U.S. military, for U.S. intelligence, for foreign policy, was simply to stop that from ever happening again. And you hear every president, whether it was President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, vow that they want to look away from terror and look towards strategically positioning the United States. And every president seems to have their compass sort of realigned by whatever crisis erupts out of the terror front. No U.S. attack has happened like we saw on the scale of 9/11 on American soil, but it has reshaped how America understands itself in the world in so many ways. And it is interesting now to see how we shape this next round of the U.S. fight against terrorism, because it's impossible to kill an idea. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS, those will continue to foster and fester in ungoverned spaces like Afghanistan.
Margret Brennan, these are really difficult times, but it is so good to talk to you once again. Thank you so much, Margret.
Thank you so much, Elaine.